Jeremiah 31 and 33, verse 33. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. So the righteousness which succeeds the Pharisees is not a righteousness of trying to make the law ever more strict. The righteousness which exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees is the righteousness of the new covenant. One which can only come from God by writing His law within our hearts, changing our nature to be like His nature, to be partakers of the divine nature, as we saw in 2 Peter 1 and verse 4. That's how our righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. As long as we try to conform to this external law, we may win battles, as we've said before. We may win this battle and that battle, but we will never win the war. Why? Because as long as it's external conformance for self, sin will always find fertile ground in our souls. And something will lead us away towards self in another direction, somewhere along the line. We may hold out for a day, a week, a year, 70 years, but we will not hold out for all eternity. Because as long as there is that root for self, somewhere in the space of eternity we will choose for self and destroy the peace and the joy that God has known within Himself in the Trinity for all eternity, because He never chooses for self. That's why we must be transformed and take on that righteousness which is fit for eternity, the righteousness of the new covenant. When we become divine in nature by God's work in us, then sin is against our nature. A different righteousness, that transporter beam instead of the boat that will finally take us to Phoenix from New York. So again, remember, Christ is not giving new commandments. He's illustrating the problem with the Pharisees' approach and why our righteousness must exceed their righteousness. And again, why Christianity requires Christ. Because we cannot achieve that on our own, because it is not our self-willed conformance to the law. If we try to pursue our goodness through that kind of external conformance, we are falling into the same trap as the Pharisees. Okay, so remember that this does not say, you shall not lust. It's pointing out the problem that even though we may not commit adultery, there is still that fertile ground for lust in our souls. And even though we may not commit murder, there is still fertile ground that we will look down on another person, consider ourselves more important than them, considering them an object that's in our way, and eliminate them. So it's not you shall not have lust. It's that if all you're trying to do is not commit adultery, the problem is you still have self inside you. You need a different form of righteousness. If we continue on in Matthew 5, we'll see a section of Scripture that has confused no end of people, wondering, how do we understand these words? And it's the same principle, that Christ is not giving commands. He's illustrating the problem with a righteousness built upon external conformance. In Matthew 5 and in verse 38, he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat too. And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." So people ask, and they say, well, am I really supposed to do this? If someone comes along and just punches me on one side of my face, am I supposed to literally turn around so he can punch me on the other side of my face? Is this a command that Jesus is giving us? No, it's not a command. It's an illustration of Christianity, of the new approach to law. What Jesus is saying is that Christians never stop loving. It doesn't matter whether the person hugs you or whether the person belts you in the face. we don't stop loving them. Because our love is not contingent upon what we receive from the other person. So we love those who give us a reason to love them, and we must also love those who give us a reason to hate them. Whether it's they're suing us, whether they're physically assaulting us, or whether they're conscripting us as they could as Roman soldiers to take a Jew and make him carry his gear for a mile. It's not a commandment. It's an illustration of the way that love works as opposed to the way external conformance to an outside law works. Christians can never take a vacation from loving. There is no time off as a Christian. Remember, Christianity is the life of always taking the smallest piece of pie. Never a break, 24/7, 365. We must love everyone, whether the person who punches us in the face or the person who gives us a hug. Just like God, where Jesus literally loved the ones who blindfolded him and punched him in the face. The ones who tore the flesh from his bones with the scourge. The ones who spit upon him and mocked him, stripped him naked, and nailed his body to a piece of wood and left him there to die. He could have left at any time. He was God. He could have said, I'm out of here, and turned the whole world to a grease spot. He chose to stay. With every lash of the whip, with every painful step, and with every suffocating breath. Because he never stopped loving us. That's what he's telling us. No matter how extreme, even the one who punches you in the face literally, Christians do not stop loving, ever, no matter whom, because our love does not depend on what we receive from the other person, even if it is evil. Just like he starts off, or how he concludes, that what I say to you, do not resist him who is evil. But whoever slaps you, love them too. Always looking out for the other person, not for ourselves, as we saw in Philippians 2 earlier on. God's love is like that. Jesus is calling us by these examples and these illustrations to live in our everyday lives the perfect love of God. And we see that as we continue on in this dissertation that Jesus is given. Right after this, where he talks about, if someone punches you, you don't stop loving them. You think about what is best for them. And if that means turning the other cheek, that's what you do. And if it's not turning the other cheek, that's what you do. It doesn't so much matter what we do, but the point is that we always want to love them. And literally, if loving them means turning the other cheek, we do. And if loving them is not turning the other cheek, we don't. We see this frequently, that if you're a wife or perhaps a husband who is being beaten by your husband, turning the other cheek is probably not loving them. Loving them is doing something to break that dysfunction in the family and not sacrifice the children to our own selfish obsessions or ourselves or others. But you know what? If the loving thing to do is to let someone sue us or to let someone conscript us, that's what we should do. Our life based upon love, not based upon self. So we see this after this exposition about even if they punch you, you don't stop loving them. Why? Well, look what he says. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, the ones who punch you in the face or take you to court. Pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. So as children of God, we're supposed to be like God. And now how does Jesus describe the way that God is? For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Just like God, we can never stop loving. It doesn't matter whether they're righteous or unrighteous, good or evil. Our fellow human beings, in fact, all creation, is to be loved, not exploited for self. And he continues, for if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax gatherers do the same? That's that human selfish love we saw before. The love that loves because. The love that's enslaved to self. The love that is not universal because it loves those who give us a reason to love them.